Hi, my name is Elke Feuer. I'm an author and a fiction book coach. So, editing. I think that's one thing that writers either love or they hate. Either way, editing can be a very long and strenuous process. In this video, I'm going to share with you my 4-part phase that I use to edit my own books. I'm also going to share with you why I use this process, as well as share with you some recommendations for how to edit your own fiction book. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. My 4-part process looks like this. Part 1, where I set the book aside for anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks, just depending on what's going on with my schedule and obviously what the timeline is for the book. If I can allow 4 weeks, I prefer 4 weeks, but if not, then I usually stick with 2. And once I've set it aside, that's when I pick it back up, and what I do is I read through the whole book from start to finish. I don't actually do any editing on the book itself. I just basically make very detailed notes of any issues with the flow, the plot, the characters, setting, just the chapters, scenes, everything and anything to do with the book. I make very detailed notes. If it's feeling really disjointed and not really flowing really well, or I see some major plot holes, then I like to also create 2 things. One is a very detailed Excel spreadsheet that basically maps out each scene, who's in the scene, what's happening in the scene, a lot of detail. Sometimes I just need something like a big picture view. I like to use a timeline, which basically just captures the chapter, what's the main thing that's happening in the scene, as well as who are the characters in that scene. And that just really gives me just a quick timeline of what's going on of the story. If I'm struggling to really if there are a lot of plot holes or issues or character problems with the character arcs, those 2 things really help me out with that, okay? The last part of phase 1 is I actually, once I've created whatever I need with my notes or the spreadsheet or the timeline, or sometimes all of the above, I then go back and I read through the book and fix all of the issues that I have or that I found. And I also go back and fix all of those issues that I made a note of when I read through the book the very first time. The second phase of my editing process is where I like to print, if possible, the book, or read through the book from start to finish again, as well as read it from the end to the beginning. And then I'm just making sure that everything that all the changes that I made to the characters, the flow of the book, any plot hole issues, any big picture things like that, that they work and it's fixed all of the issues with the book. And if you can't print the book out, I recommend reading it out loud, because sometimes when you read it out loud, it's very different from when you're just reading it on the screen. And do that when you're reading it forward, as well as from the end of the book to the beginning. The third phase of my book is basically, by this point, there should be all the major plot point, story arc issues, the flow of the story, all those major issues would be fixed by this phase. Okay, so that all that I'm looking at this part is just my characters, dialogue, chapters and scenes, as well as my settings, and obviously sentences. Now, what that looks like is, for instance, for my characters, I like to look at, are my characters consistent as far as what they look like, more specifically, what they sound like. I have a tendency to make my characters all sound the same. So I always make sure that I go back through and I'm reading just from their perspective and making sure that everything and anything about them that makes them unique is showing up consistently throughout the whole book. The same is true with my dialogue for the characters, as well as just making sure that if there are dialogue things that I need to do, for instance, I've had characters in the books, some that are Scottish, some that are Irish, some that are English, some that are Caribbean. So I really needed to make sure that to read through carefully that each character was distinct. And also to make sure to throw in a little bit of what makes, you know, a Scottish person talking sounds Scottish, right? Little things that, you know, you might not necessarily think about as you're writing, but somebody, if you happen to have somebody who's Scottish read your book, will be like, well, that's not how a Scottish person sounds. So those are things that I like to do when it comes to the dialogue. With regards to the settings, it's just for me two-part. I like to make sure that the settings are really grounded into the story and they really pull you and draw you in from an emotional perspective as well as visual. I like to make sure that I've used all 5 of my senses when I'm describing a setting, especially if it's a setting that's important to the scene or important for the character or the book overall. That's one of the things for me with my settings that I like to make sure when I'm going through and editing. With regards to the chapters and the scenes, it's just I like to make sure that the chapters really punch, whether it's the beginning grabs you or the end keeps you, you know, does it have a hook? Is it really going to, you know, does it fit the story and the flow? Is it grabbing your attention so the reader is going to want to go to the next chapter, or is it kind of blah? So that's kind of what I like to look at in this phase. And with my sentences, this is kind of where I look at some hard and fast rules with passive voice, all those kind of things. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail with that because everybody's process when it comes to that is very different. And I love fragmented sentences, which thankfully my editor, she allows me to do that. That's just sort of my style. And I try to make sure that when I do it, I don't do it for all of my characters, just a specific character, or if it's part of their internal dialogue. So for me, that's just an additional thing that I have to pay attention to when it comes to my sentences and making sure that I'm not overdoing that, as well as obviously sharpening them up, tightening them up, that I'm not using the same words all the time. Because as writers, we have our own little set of words that we tend to overuse, right? So those are some of the things that I like to look for as well too. Phase 4 is when all of those changes have been incorporated and I feel comfortable enough that I'm ready to actually share my book with others. And that includes 2 parts. One is beta readers. I always send my books to beta readers first. And at the time that I do that, I also schedule appointments with my professional readers. I use 2. A copy editor as well as somebody who does proofreading for me as well. So I do the beta readers. I have a very detailed sort of question guide for them to go by to give me feedback that I'm looking for specifically. Or depending on the beta reader, I have some beta readers that have been with me for like pretty much all my books that kind of know what I'm looking for. So I let them wing it how they want to. But mostly I try to provide a list of questions for things that I'm looking for as far as the feedback from them from a reader perspective. So that's the 4th phase. And when it comes to professional editors, like I said, I send it off to them. My professional editors, after I've incorporated the changes that I made from my beta readers, okay? And my professional editors are usually pretty good. They get back to me depending on their schedule 2-3 weeks, and then that gives me another week to 2 weeks to incorporate any changes that they make. As well, or recommend, I should say, not make, because they really recommend stuff for me. I love my editors. I've been working with them for a really long time, and they just really get my voice and my style, as well as their really give me a lot of detailed information. So that would be something that I would recommend that you make sure that you do, is to get a copy editor and a professional editor or proofreader that will give you really good feedback. And I've been very blessed in that respect. All right, so that is it, my 4-part phases. Now you might be thinking, well, why would you need to have a process? Don't you just go in and start editing your book and reading it through and just, editing as you go? And not to say that that's not an option. I know a lot of writers who do it that way. I personally prefer to use my process, and I'm going to share with you why, right? In case, you're curious and to see whether it's a good fit for you. The first way that having a process helps me is that it helps me to remember all the things that need to be done. Because I think as writers, we have a tendency to edit the things that we enjoy editing, or perhaps we just focus on one part of the editing and then we forget about all the other things. And that's something that I'm notorious for doing. So that is another reason why I created the guide for myself, so that I make sure that I incorporate everything that needs to be considered when I'm editing my book, instead of kind of relying on my memory, because that ain't gonna happen. The second way that this process helps me is that it helps me to prep my book for my editors and my beta readers. Because a lot of times, if you haven't gone through some of the things that need to be taken care of before you send it to an editor, it can end up costing you a lot of money, or just time, just back and forth with your beta readers. Not to say that that can't happen. However, if you have a guide to help you make sure that you've covered as much of the editing process as possible, then it reduces that back and forth, and like I said, the money that it could cost you to have your book edited 3, 4, or more times, right? So that's how it helps me. The third thing it does is that it really helps to set my book up for success. Because let's face it, the editing process is a tricky one. Even when you have your book edited, I like to say, even bestsellers, there's mistakes, right? You really want to give your book the best chance that you can. And that means just really having a process that really helps you to make sure that you are including all the things that you need to consider when you're editing your book. And give your book the best chance that you can, whether that's at the beginning or with your beta readers, with your professional editors. You really want to make sure, and a process has really helped me with being able to do that. So my recommendations for editing your book. Now, obviously you can take notes from what I've just said. If that's your thing, that's cool. But I would recommend personally is find your own process. Because while there are hard and fast rules, like I mentioned, that a lot of editors recommend do this, do this, do this, do this, that's absolutely true. What I find is finding your own process of how you edit really will help you to make sure that you're incorporating all of those things, plus perhaps areas that as a writer that you need to focus on specifically for you. And that is how a process and finding your own process can really help you to do that. The second thing I recommend when you're editing your fiction book is to look at the recommendations from your beta readers, and if you've already perhaps gone through the professional editing phase, as constructive feedback for improving your book as well as your writing skills. And this can be a tough one because, when I first started having people read my book, I really got offended that, or trying to explain myself why I said this and why I said that and why I wrote it this way, instead of looking at it constructively. Because the truth is, our books are our babies, right? And there's certain things that we absolutely love, but about that book or about that story or that character, but they just don't fit. And sometimes it's hard for us to see the forest for the trees, right? Or the trees for the forest. But at the same time, we have to just sort of step away and just look at the feedback that we're getting and look at it and say, how can I look at this constructively? How is it really going to help my book be a better book? How is this feedback helping me? How can it help me to become a better writer? And when you look at it from that perspective, instead of the perspective of, what do you mean? This is my baby. This is my book. You can't say that. It makes it so much easier and allows you to grow thick skin when it comes to getting feedback on your book. Because I will be honest with you, if you haven't published your first book yet, it's not going to get any easier, especially when you put it out there and you find people that hate it and they write horrible reviews, and you just have to be able to just say, you know what, that's all good. They're entitled to their opinion, and to not take it personally. And this is actually a good practice for that. It was for me, at least. So I want to encourage you to think about that when you're editing your fiction book. The third thing that I recommend is to create or find your own guide for editing. Now this kind of goes hand in hand with the first one, which is finding your process, because finding your process takes time, right? And while you're doing that, you can create your guide or start with a guide, or what I did, which was basically I looked at a lot of different people, articles, things like that, and I kind of compiled it, and that's why I broke it into phases, and then the feedback from my professional editors, and kind of layered those in as well too, so that it wasn't sort of, this is what I'm going to use and this is it and it's set in stone. I think it's important to, as you create or find a guide, is to understand that it's going to change and to tweak it to your specific needs as a writer, because every writer is different and they're in different phases of their writing journey. So I think that that's why I always say to find or create your own guide and process so that you get your needs met. Do you have a process for editing your fiction book? If you do, I would love to hear about it. Share it with me in the comments. If you're like, what the hell's a guide? I have no clue. And you'd like to get your hands on my editing guide, I will leave it in, I'll leave the link to it in the comments of this video so that you can check it out for yourself. It's absolutely free. So you can check that out and start working and creating your own process. If you like this video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you would like to get more tips and strategies for writing your fiction book. Have a fabulous day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.